You. Sure.
You got it. Okay.
Thank you very much for coming out on a Friday night. It's kind of tough because that's time to usually have a drink with your friends or follow up on your homework. I would assume that most of the audience are aged younger than Jay and I. And most of you would have been born in an era where the world would have been highly unipolar. That's the time when there was only one guy, basically was telling everybody else what to do. However, it's changed just a few years ago to a much more multipolar kind of world where there's a lot of degree of revisionism by countries that would have been very little, but are growing to be much bigger, inclusive of the Indias of the world, the Russias of the world, the Indonesias of the world, the Mexicos of the world, the Turkeys of the world, the Nigerias of the world. Such revisionism has entailed a much more multipolar kind of world. And ironically, in a much more multipolar kind of world, multilateralism has been on decline. And I've gone through that in my experience as a public servant when I was the trade minister. And I've discovered how difficult it would have been to multilateralize, which is an irony. At the rate that you become multipolar, you can't multilateralize. Whereas you could have multilateralized a lot more easily in a much more unipolar kind of world. And we're now stared at with and by certain things that are paradoxical. And the first paradox is what we've seen in the last, I would say, 20 years, ever since we've discovered the internet in the early 90s in a big way, where we thought that things were going to be so cool for everybody on the planet by way of being able to not only democratize information, but also democratize ideas. However, the divergence between the democratization of information and that of ideas has gotten worse in the last few decades. And it's quite a bit of a mockery as we're seeing globally how conversations have been so polarizing and so polarized. It's so difficult to get somebody on the left to understand what somebody on the right is saying or has been saying or will be saying, and vice versa, to get somebody on the right to understand what the left or the center have been saying. And this is kind of like manifested in the kind of inequality that we're seeing manifested in the Gini coefficient ratio, how the haves are going in a certain parking lot, whereas the have-nots are going to a much smaller parking lot. That's the first paradoxical observation. The second one is what a lot of people have been talking about in recent years. We call this artificial intelligence. I've been spending a little over a year in Silicon Valley, where conversations on AI have been pretty pervasive. But what I've discovered is that the technologists tend to have the strong desire to just go it alone without pushing the narrative forward in a multidisciplinary manner. That hurts. That hurts the economists, that hurts the environmentalists, that hurts the culturalists, that hurts the sociologists, that hurts the spiritualists, that hurts the philosophers, that hurts anybody beyond the technological dimension. At the rate that this becomes so unidisciplinary, without being able to push this in a much more multidisciplinary manner, I foresee a future where the end result is going to be quite malign. It's going to lack wisdom. It's not going to be as judicious as you might want it to be. To the point the disease might just become malignant. That, I think, is a discount to humanity, most particularly to those in Southeast Asia that want to be better citizens of the world in the next 10, 20, or 30 years. The third is with regards to sustainability. I've been spending quite a bit of time talking to experts in sustainability. What I've discovered is that the experts of sustainability think they're so cool. They think everything can be achieved by 2050 with realism, not ultra optimism. That also is a mockery because their narrative, in my view, resonates to not more than 15 to 20% of the population of the world. Whereas the remaining 80 to 85% of the population of the world, they're still more concerned about putting food on a table, including many of us in Java, Kalimantan, much less roti. Not to mention those in sub-Saharan countries. That is a discount. I want to point out a couple of examples, one being India and one being Indonesia. India and Indonesia are electrified to the extent of about 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita. I've been having constant debates, discourses with members of multilateral institutions with regards to the definition of what it takes to be modern. Why is modernity key in our discussion? Because it takes modernity to understand the narrative of sustainability. How do you define modernity? How do you define modernization? There's so many metrics you can go by. I would go by electrification. I would go by 5,000 to 6,000 kilowatt hour. If you're electrified to the extent of 5,000 to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, I think you're modern. You can charge your handphones, you can use your microwave, you can use your fridge, you can use whatever. However, certain multilateral institutions still utilize 1,000 kilowatt hour per capita as the definition of modernity. I struggle with that because that's where Indonesia is. And I know a lot of people in Indonesia don't behave as modernly as some members of the Harvard University. So if we were to embrace the definition of modernity at 5,000 to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, then we go by what India produces on a yearly basis and Indonesia produces on a yearly basis. India produces about 19,000 megawatts of power generation capabilities, whereas Indonesia, 3,000. Constantly in the last 20 years, most of which is coal, by the way. We go by the rate of production on a yearly basis of India and Indonesia at 19 and 13 respectively. Anybody want to know how long it's going to take India and Indonesia to get electrified at 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita? 90 to 100 years. That's well beyond 2050, ladies and gentlemen. The irreconcilable nature between the narrative of development and the narrative of sustainability is something that I think the younger generation, including me, need to take a view on. And the view taking needs to be open-minded. It cannot be un-open-minded. That's what's happening in many classrooms, what's happening in many rooms where there's just not enough degree of open-mindedness with respect to how we're going to be able to reconcile these two seemingly widely irreconcilable nature of the two narratives. So, 90 to 100 years for India and Indonesia. You want to know how long it's going to take for Nigeria? Nigeria is electrified only to the extent of 65 kilowatt hour per capita. It's going to take about 200 to 250 years. So we can kiss whatever COP decided in terms of attaining carbon neutrality, goodbye. 2050 versus 100 years to 200 years from today. And this is pertinent to about 80% of the population of the planet. We know since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've emitted about 1,700 gigatons of carbon at a rate of about 35 to 40 gigatons per year in the last 10 years. We know that those outside Europe, those outside the United States and Northern America have contributed quite a bit as of late. But on a cumulative basis, since 1800, no more than 10%. I'm not trying to be the cheerleader for China here, nor other developing economies, but this is a snapshot of where we are. So, what's the solution going forward? Absolutely, we want to go renewables. Absolutely, we want to go the cool way. The cool way of electrifying, energizing anybody on the planet without emitting any carbon. Indonesia has got great potential. Philippines has got great potential. But I'll come back later on what the challenges are going forward. So I've talked about the irreconcilable nature between the narrative of sustainability and that of development. This, I think, needs to get fixed. And it can only get fixed by way of being open-minded about what it takes on the demand side and what it takes on the supply side. Southeast Asia, which is a collection of 10 countries, 10 economies, 4 of which are monarchies, 2 are single-party states, the rest are supposedly robust democracies. Some of the monarchies are not absolute. Only one absolute monarchy, that's Brunei, whereas the other 3 monarchies are pretending to be democratic. I think they're going to be democratic, or if not more democratic going forward. It's a collection of 10 economies worth about $4 trillion over a few islands with 700 million people. I think there is a collective vision in terms of wanting to be better, wanting to be more prosperous, wanting to be healthier, wanting to live longer amongst many of us in Southeast Asia. I can say that on behalf of Indonesians, but I can pretty much say that on behalf of the other Southeast Asians that live today. If I take a look at the last 30 years, the GDP per capita of Southeast Asia has grown about 2.7 times. Compare that with the GDP per capita growth of China at 10 times. I'll say it again. 2.7 times, Southeast Asia on average, China 10 times. There's essentially 4 reasons as to why we underperformed with respect to China from a GDP per capita standpoint. The first one is the underinvestment in infrastructure. Clearly, China has outspent all of us in Southeast Asia in the last 30 years. Second is the underinvestment in education. China right now ranks number 1 in PISA achievement. PISA is basically the measurement of the capabilities and abilities of 15-year-olds with respect to STEM and lingual proficiency. Singapore is number 2. In Southeast Asia, there's only 2 countries that are above the global average. Singapore being number 1 in Southeast Asia, globally number 2. Vietnam, number 2 in Southeast Asia. The rest, the other 8 countries are all below global average. Global average at about 480. Indonesia is at 380 something. The Vietnamese have taken our lunch. If you talk to any Vietnamese in this class, oh, good for you, because they're going to take your lunch. The Vietnamese, if you talk to the average competitive Vietnamese, they're not interested in taking over Singapore. They're interested in taking over China. That's their mindset. To the point their mothers will mortgage the house to send their kids to school, good schools. And it's obvious in any dimension, entrepreneurship, academia, even social institutions, they're so ambitious. And it's manifested in how the 15-year-olds are outscoring us in education. The second is really governance. Governance is manifested in the optimal intersection between power and talent. And unfortunately, we've seen such a discount in any type of ideology, in any type of government, in any country. Democracies are supposed to be great in democratizing talent. But as of late, democracies have been known for selecting talent a lot more based on patronage and or loyalty as opposed to meritocracy. Whereas China is an autocracy for a long time until recently, I think they've been so good at democratizing talent, so good at selecting talent a lot more based on meritocracy as opposed to patronage and or loyalty. We see this quite pervasively in most Southeast Asian countries, with the exception of Singapore. Singapore, it's very clear. You go meet a politician, you go meet a public servant, you go meet an academician, you go meet an entrepreneur, you go meet a leadership of a social institution. It's very clear. The selection of talent would have been based on meritocracy, not loyalty and or patronage, which I think is a discount to anybody that wants to do better in the long run. So you've got underinvestment in infrastructure, you've got underinvestment in education, you've got basically lack of governance capabilities, both at the governance level and at the leadership level. The last bit is competition. Competition, we take a look at Southeast Asia, there's so many metrics to measure competition. But one entrepreneurial competitive metric is the number of business permits or licenses are issued on a yearly basis per 1,000 adult people basis. The average for Southeast Asia in the last 30 years would have been only 1 license, whereas in China, it's 9. That's the average for Southeast Asia, 1. You guys want to know what the number is for Philippines and Indonesia? 0.3. Singapore, it's 9. So if we can't issue business licenses, we can't expect ourselves to be more competitive. And I think there's 2 or 3 reasons as to why we're not issuing as many licenses as the Singaporeans are or as the Chinese are. One is lack of money. It's structural. If we take a look at most Southeast Asian economies, the broad money ratio, which is the ratio of money supply to GDP, is less than 100%. Indonesia, it's at 46%. Typical developed economies, money supply to GDP ratios are above 100%. Singapore is close to 200%. Until and unless we move the money supply upward, I don't think people would be desiring of getting business licenses to be entrepreneurial. The second reason as to why there's few licenses being issued is what I call the bureaucratic dead weight. They're just slow in issuing permits and licenses. And I speak with some authority because I spent 5 years in the government. That was a joke. The third reason is just the cultural nature of Southeast Asians, of not wanting to take on risk vis-a-vis the Chinese, vis-a-vis the Singaporeans. We just don't like taking risks as much as the Singaporeans or the Chinese. So these are the 3 structural attributes as to why we're not issuing licenses as much as many as the Chinese and or the Singaporean. So we've got 4 reasons as to why Southeast Asia underperformed with respect to China. Underinvestment in infrastructure, underinvestment in education, governance or lack thereof, and lack of competition. This is an illustration of the electrification for Southeast Asian countries. It's very clear where Indonesia is. This is dated a few years ago. It's not up to date. Indonesia now is at about 1,300 kilowatt hour, whereas Singapore is at 10,000, Malaysia is at about 5,000. Malaysia is modern. Now, when it comes to sustainability, there's elitism with respect to the narrative. Second, we got to take a look at the demand and supply. Anybody here know how many followers to the Instagram account of Kylie Jenner? I should have mentioned Raffi Ahmad. 399 million. Anybody know the number of followers to Greta Thunberg? Close to 15 million. I look at Greta as the beacon of sustainability. She would paddle her way to Jakarta from Europe. She would walk, if not ride the bike. Whereas Kylie Jenner would gladly ride her private jet and burn as much carbon as possible. So if Greta is getting a lot less followership than Kylie, it probably means that the world doesn't care too much about whether or not we should emit less carbon, right? Now, if you were given an assignment to basically change the demand side of the game, I could quite easily socially re-engineer the population of the world to emit less carbon. But what's the alternative, right? If my mother is cooking using coal, I'm happy to stop coal tonight. As long as the alternatives are economically affordable and not carbon emitting. But in the absence of such, you're basically in a corner. So I look at sustainability from a demand and supply standpoint as being a lot easier on the demand side, as long as the alternatives are a lot more affordable. Whereas on the supply side, there's really two pieces of the equation. The first piece is the technology, right? I think there are technological options that are going to be able to help the world with respect to emitting a lot less carbon, if not zero carbon. You've got solar, you've got wind, you've got hydro, you've got geothermal, you've got nuclear, you've got all kinds of stuff. But at the end of the day, you've got to figure out as to whether or not the economics would work. This is the second part of the equation that really screws people out, right? And I'm in the camp that believes that it's only going to work for most, if not all, developing economies around the world if you can bring down the cost to no more than 5 cents on a per kilowatt basis. But if you talk to anybody that's good at producing solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, you're not going to make money unless you can charge more than 20 cents on a per kilowatt hour basis. If you want to be breaking even in geothermal, you got to be able to at least charge 13 cents. Half of that is really for turning on the lights at the office and paying your satpams and watering the plants. The other half, which is 6.5 cents, is really for paying the bank for principal and interest. That's just for breaking even. And right now, countries like Indonesia, much less India and Nigeria, we can't pay any more than 7 cents. But if you want this to work, we've got to make sure that this is affordable at no more than 5 cents on a per kilowatt basis. And how do you figure out the economic solution so that the supply side will be able to touch the demand side in an economically viable manner? That, I think, is what a lot of people are not going to be able to get their heads around. So I was in a conversation with Stephen Chu just a few days ago. He's the former Secretary of Energy. He's worked a lot on this. He's quite optimistic that at some point, not in the next 2 to 5 years, at some point down the line, technologically and economically, we're going to be able to bring down the cost to 5 cents, if not less. But by that time, I think we're all exposed in Sub-Sahara, in India, in Indonesia, and a lot of other developing economies around the world. So that underlines the elitism or the relative elitism of sustainability narrative. Now, if you take a look at Southeast Asia, the fiscal space and the monetary space are structurally limited. I've talked about the money supply to GDP ratios at less than 100%. For most countries in Southeast Asia, if we take a look at the fiscal space of Southeast Asia, take a look at the right-hand column. All Southeast Asian countries have a tax ratio of less than 20%. As an illustration, that compares not so well to the typical OECD countries, which have tax ratios of around 33%. So it just shows that all countries in Southeast Asia do not have robust fiscal spaces, in addition to the fact that most do not have robust monetary spaces. Okay, that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is that we take a look at the developed economies, which are not only technological capital allocators, but they're economic capital allocators. They're sitting on top of more than $100 trillion worth of liquidity, including America, Japan, Korea, Western European countries, and China. They're sitting on top of more than $100 trillion worth of liquidity. Makes you think that, okay, we can actually figure out something here so that we can transfer the technology from developed economies to developing economies that need it, and we can fund it. But there's two issues. The first is that most of these economic capital allocators have fiduciary responsibility to the owners of the capital. And that fiduciary responsibility needs to be manifested in ways that you can be accountable to. I just don't think it's realistically workable at the moment. The second is that basically the recipient countries need to figure out a way to pay them back. With such structural limitations from a monetary and fiscal standpoint, it's a challenge. So I want to walk out of this room later feeling comfortable that I've convinced you that this is not an easy problem, that this is something that's not going to get resolved by 2050. Stephen Chu would even tell me unequivocally that there's no way we're going to be able to limit the increase of the temperature of the planet by less than 2.5 degrees by 2050. As much as the rhetoric has been saying about a lot less than that. So I do think it requires open-mindedness about the geopolitics of things, about the economics of things. So if I were the United States, or if I were Japan, or if I were a Western European country, want to take a look at Southeast Asia in terms of how Southeast Asia could actually attain carbon neutrality by 2050, one of the attributes for purposes of being open-minded is, okay, from a technological standpoint, what do these guys have? One option could be nuclear. I know it's taboo, but nuclear, to me, seems to be the most scalable, seems to be the most environmentally friendly. I'm not here speaking as a marketing director of nuclear. But this is the kind of open-mindedness that I want to push to you guys. And I do believe that with, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, or 50 people that are in this classroom, if each one of you comes out of this room just getting a couple of the messages that I've uttered, I think that's a good start to be open-minded about any kind of potential resolution for the narrative of sustainability. Thank you very much.
Well, as the old folk group Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young would say, this is guaranteed to bring you down. But we're going to have a nice dialogue for a little bit, Q&A. So now it's your turn. So 3 rules on questions. Number 1, please identify yourself and your affiliation so Paquita knows where you're coming from a little bit. Number 2, try to be brief so as many people as possible get to speak. Number 3, please end with a question mark. Okay, so your turn. We'll take a round of questions because maybe you can consolidate. So I'm in the back. The hand went up first. 1, 2, 3, 4. Anybody over here? 5. That's such a nice smile. Okay, so please. And please use the microphone because we're recording this.
Hello. Okay. So my name is Jordan. I'm from Harvard Business School. Just a side info, I used to work for Tom Lembong. So an old friend of yours. Just want to ask, you mentioned that one of the biggest difference between Indonesia and Vietnam and China is basically work ethic and ambition. That translates into difference in, education task force, the difference in entrepreneurship, etc. Like, what do you see as the biggest barrier, to improve the work ethic, to improve the ambition of Indonesian people? Because, I don't think, to be honest, we are not known for our work ethic. Like, what do you see as the levers we can pull to improve that?
Well, Jordan, if you were to wake up every day at 4:30 in the morning and start sowing the whatever that's out there outside your house, everybody in the house is going to follow. So I think it's going to take leadership by example, right? And I've been kind of tinkering with the possible idea that leadership is an act of serendipity. So any country, given that sort of circumstance, I think has a damn good chance of, coming up with the kind of work ethic, irrespective of ethnicity, irrespective of any kinds of attributes that you might think are, influential in shaping the kind of narrative that you have in mind. And I'm on the board of one tech company, and it's just mind-boggling. We were trying to recruit for a position of seniority. We got 100 applications, 60 of which were Vietnamese. Only 10 Indonesian. And the rest are Singaporean. And we shortlisted to 3, 2 of which are Vietnamese. The third one is Singaporean. We gave the job to the Singaporean. 3 of them are cognitively equivalent. But I give it to the Singaporean. You want to know something about Southeast Asia, whether in Beijing, London, DC, or anywhere around the world, they don't call the Brunei ambassador. They don't call the Indonesian ambassador. They want to know something about Southeast Asia. They call the Singaporean ambassador with the presumption that this person knows a lot more and can articulate the narrative. So I'm not suggesting Indonesia can't do that. I'm not suggesting the Thais can't do that. I think we've just got to copy whatever the Singaporeans have gotten good at. And the Vietnamese, I think they take it a notch higher. We're not happy with the Singaporean way. I think we could do it better because we want to copy what the Chinese have done. They've picked and, chosen whatever it's good, whatever that's not good.
Next. Who was number 2? Please.
Hello, Pak Gita.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Listia. I go to Northeastern University, but now I'm an intern at MIT Energy Initiative. So we work a lot with, developing a country's effort toward, expediting, our effort to sustainable energy. So you mentioned about electrification. I want to focus on that. Knowing that Indonesia is the largest nickel producer, or like accounting 33% of global production, and it is economic opportunities for Indonesia, because like, you know, Tesla's or like those EV companies, they're looking at Indonesia right now. But on the same time, nickel mining is also very carbon intensive industries, and it's also damaging the environment in Sulawesi, like deforestation, water pollution, and also like disrupting indigenous community. I mean, I want to ask like your perspective on how to balance economic opportunities and also environmental sustainability for the future of, you know, nickel mining, also the future of Indonesia. Thank you.
Well, I think we got to take a look at sustainability with the perspective of total accounting, right? As much as your EV is not emitting carbon, but you're not looking at how the batteries are going to be disposed of and how everything else about the EV manufacturing process is going to be environmentally clean or not. That's not total accounting perspective, right? And so many of these conversations don't take a view on total accounting. I'm with you, but if you take a look at the last Woodson McKinsey report, they're good on energy sources, right? The next 2 to 3 decades, one would think that the demand for fossil is going to be like this, but it's not. It's actually plateauing. It's flatlining. You know why? Demand for fossil from automotive is going to be like this. Demand for fossil for petrochemical is going to be like this. You know that EV car you've been driving? Everything in it is petrochemical. And everybody wants more fancy dandy stuff in the car. The more fancy dandy stuff you want it in the car, the more petrochemical manufacturing processes are involved. And that's going to spike up the curve. And the demand for fossil from aviation is going to go up. So the net effect of the declination and the inclination is basically the flat lining. So I'm with you, but this is a bit separate from the latest discussion on the evolution from nickel to lithium and from lithium to sodium, right? So I'm not sure how relevant Indonesia is going to be from a nickel standpoint beyond 5 years from today, because the conversations among the EV makers around the world, they're not talking about nickel. They're already talking about sodium. On top of which there's hydrogen, right? Toyota is adamant on using hydrogen capability as opposed to non-hydrogen capability for non-emission of carbon. So this is the kind of conversation that needs to be provoked, I think, to more Indonesians. But at the end of the day, anytime you want to talk about sustainability, I think you have to take a look at it from a total accounting standpoint. Yeah.
I think the next question is over here. There's a microphone, please.
Well, thank you so much for your fascinating presentation. I'm from Harvard Law School. So you mentioned about the average tax ratio is quite low in Southeast Asian countries, particularly in Indonesia. So that trigger the very limited, restricted fiscal space, monetary space. And particularly I'm interested about the environmental tax. So there's a carbon tax and there's a carbon pricing. So this tax reform in Indonesia, in Southeast Asian countries, the environmental tax and the personal income tax, corporate income tax, how to reform this tax structure system to balance this fiscal space. And how do you think this tax reform and this government public expenditure impact on this government budget, and how this impact on these Southeast Asian countries, particularly Indonesia, the carbon neutrality target by 2050. I think that also impact the carbon neutrality, this capacity to 2050. Thank you so much.
I don't foresee the ability of the Indonesian government to tax upon carbon emission as easily as some might view it. And that's going to basically stymie the process of attaining carbon neutrality for Indonesia. I'm actually a bigger believer of technology as opposed to policy, right? I think there's enough technological innovation that's going to help developing economies to reduce or to decarbonize so that they can actually help themselves in achieving or attaining that carbon neutrality target by 2050. I don't think they'll fulfill it, but I think they'll get closer to the target of carbon neutrality by 2050, more by way of technology as opposed to by policy. From a fiscal standpoint, I've shown you earlier the tax ratio of Indonesia is 9%, right? It's low. The other Southeast Asian countries are also in the teens. You know, I like to joke with my Republican American friends that Southeast Asia is highly Republican because our tax ratio is so low, right? The economy is so highly privatized. We could be a libertarian state, if not a Republican state, or region, rather, for Southeast Asia. But it's not by design, ideologically. It's by way of the lack of, I think, governance capabilities, right? We don't have the kind of efficiency in our tax collection capabilities all across Southeast Asia yet. But we're going to get there as soon as Jay selects cabinet members a lot more based on meritocracy. Yeah.
Please, use the mic.
Yeah. Microphone. Yeah. Just as an add-on, the proportion vis-a-vis our budget that's needed to service our debt has gone up from 6% to about 15 or 16%. So it's a zero-sum game, okay? Every increment that's needed within the budget to service the debt is a decrement to everything else that you're going to need from the budget, including to build bridges, to send people on LPDP, to schools like Harvard University, to subsidize for energy purposes. But it's not as bad as that in the US. The budget in the US, which you have seen recently, right? It came to almost a shutdown. 20% of the government budget is needed to service the debt. It's now bigger than the defense budget of the United States government, if it's any consolation to Southeast Asians here. Sorry.
Thank you for delivering your remarks this evening. And my name's Althea, and I'm a student at the college here, concentrating in government and East Asian studies. And my question relates to you talking about electrification as a form of modernity. And in the context of Southeast Asia, there was this interconnected power grid that was proposed by ASEAN in the early 2000s. And how do you see this developing, especially you mentioning this difficulty of multilateralism, and elitism in sustainability, but also keeping to your message about being open-minded? How do you see this developing? And just wanted to hear your thoughts about it.
So what's the question again?
How do you see this developing? Because on one hand, you talk about this challenge in being multilateral and this elitism existing within the sphere of sustainability in Southeast Asia, but your message is also to be open-minded. So how do you see that developing?
Well, you can be open-minded with your fellow villagers. You may not be able to be open-minded with somebody from Iceland, right? So multilateralism is challenged. It's in decline. But the beauty about ASEAN or Southeast Asia is that we're different. I think we're a lot more cohesive culturally, economically. We're not unionized from a fiscal standpoint like the Europeans. We're not unionized monetarily like the Europeans, but we're cool. You know, we go to hundreds of meetings every year. I went through that in 5 years when I was in government. I have attended hundreds of meetings with no purpose. And I joke with my American and European friends because, you know, the Europeans, they typically, dude, you know, if you go to a meeting, you got to have an objective. Well, our objective is to have a meeting. And I'll tell you the beauty about this. The beauty about having no empirically defined objective in attending a meeting is that somebody that earns $75,000 per year sits down with somebody that earns $1,000 a year, 25 times in a year. They get it. They understand each other. When a Singaporean sits in front of a Laotian for 25 times in a year, when a Laotian expresses her concern, the Singaporean gets it. That's the beauty about our cultural dimension of ASEAN. And I'll point out, in the last 2,000 years, as much as we've been graced by Buddhism for 400 years, Hinduism for 600 years, colonization, Christianity, independence, democratization for the 700 years thereafter, you know how many people have died by way of differences of opinions based on ethnicity, race, and religion? 9 million. 9 million. 1 million of which, 3 million of which took place during the Vietnam War, over 22 years. Compare the 9 million to Europe during the same 2,000-year period. You know how many people died because of differences of views based on ethnicity, race, and religion? Close to 200 million. 120 of which took place in a span of 35 years between World War I and World War II. So I claim that Southeast Asia is a place of peace and stability, right? Which is a precondition for any kind of economic prosperity. But here's the problem. Southeast Asians have been able to cleverly embrace the the culture of pragmatism. We don't want to bother our neighbors, right? We want happy situations, right? That's what the Cambodians think of the Indonesians, what the Filipinos think of the Malaysians, and all that good stuff. But we don't embrace enough of the culture of principles. This is where the Singaporean differentiates herself from many of us. They embrace both the culture of pragmatism and the culture of principles. The Singaporeans, by way of embracing the culture of principles, I want to be excellent in education. I want to be excellent in healthcare. I want to be excellent in this and that and this and that. I've been actually arguing that Singapore, I think, could be regarded as a pretty damn good liberal democracy. I may get eggs on this. But I think they've learned to give more space to the opposition. They've learned to give more space to the media. But they've been damn good at distributing not just power to the hands of many, but distributing public goods. When it comes to healthcare, welfare, intellect, moral value, social value, just take a look at the Singaporeans. They don't throw trash anywhere like the other Southeast Asians. So I think, you know, are we going to get there multilaterally? I would caveat it semi-multilaterally within Southeast Asia. Yeah.
This gentleman here.
Oh, okay.
No, these were...
You'll get your turn. We'll get them.
We'll say they were pre-ordered. Okay, please. Please.
Oh, you didn't type in on the website your question? I'll get to you.
Thank you, Pak Gita, for the wonderful talk. So my question is, you mentioned that the broad money supply of Indonesia compared to other countries is relatively low.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Bimraj. I'm studying economics and mathematics at Boston University, and I'm an undergraduate sophomore. So my question pertains to the broad money supply you mentioned, that Indonesia is relatively low compared to the other countries. But if we increase broad money supply, right, and assuming the quantity theory of money, and we assume velocity is constant, then this will just bloat the nominal GDP and keep the real GDP the same. And it could possibly have inflationary effects such as the one that occurs in Latin America. I think, so my question is, rather than seeing the broad money supply, I noticed that the financial system in Indonesia is not that big yet. It's not robust. I think if we work on building the financial system, making it bigger, it can promote more investment. So what is your take on that? Do you think it's enlarging the financial system or broad money supply?
I'm saying exactly what you're suggesting, right? The capital markets to GDP ratio is at 45%. The banking to GDP ratio is at 45%. The money supply to GDP ratio is at 45, 46%, right? There's 3 ways to increase money supply. Number 1, you print, like how the Americans have been doing since 100 years ago. Since 1914, to be exact.
Yes, yes.
It's not just since 2008, okay? You ever wonder when the Federal Reserve was created? Do you know when? 1914. That's when they decided to print money. They call it sophisticatedly quantitative easing. Okay? We could print money, but there's hyperinflationary risk, right? But you know, when you measure inflation, you don't measure just based on CPI. You measure based on the rate of growth of money supply, right? And you measure velocity of money. You're a student of economics. You just measure those things, right? To the extent that they're still within manageability, you can print. I'm not a printer here. I'm not advocating for printing. The second way is to borrow. If you borrow, not so wisely right now because interest rate environment is not so great for you, right? You know how many percent the Fed has actually increased interest rate in the last 2 years? More than 2,000%. It was 25 basis points. Now it's over 5%. That's 2,000%. Highly different from the Volcker era. In the 70s, he basically jacked up interest rate from 10% to 20%, which is only 100% increase. So you can imagine from a relative standpoint what sort of a shock it has been for the United States and the rest of the world. So you don't want to borrow money. Plus, there's going to be 1 or 2 guys that are going to be criticizing the Minister of Finance for borrowing, right? The third way is what I think is really cool. I call that FDI. But here's a catch. The FDI for Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines has been averaging about $100 to $400 on a per capita per year basis. Indonesia in 2021 was able to get $30 billion. Over 280 million, that's a little over $100 per capita per year. You know what the FDI for Singapore is on a per capita per year basis? 105 billion. In 2021, on a per capita per year basis, $19,000. Let me repeat, $100 to $400 for the others, $19,000. So the small country argument doesn't work because Singapore was able to get $105 billion. Indonesia, the second biggest recipient of FDI in Southeast Asia, only got $30 billion. How is it? The interest rate in Singapore is much lower than that in Indonesia. So I've been arguing that FDI is not a function of ideology. It's not a function of geography. It's not a function of natural resources. It's a function of one damn thing. It's called the rule of law. You go to Singapore court with a strong position, legally speaking, you could be the poorest, you're going to win because the judge makes $2.5 million. And he or she would have likely have been a student of Jay or other great professors at great universities around the world. They would have been some of the best educated people. So if you have plans to be in the government, You make sure whatever you think, whatever you do, translates into our sheer ability to be a nation of law. When that happens, the needle is going to move from $100 per capita per year to $1,000, to $2,000, to $3,000. Imagine if we were to be able to move the needle from $100 to $1,000 per capita per year. We're looking at about $280 billion worth of capital per year coming into our country as opposed to $30 billion. You know what that's going to do to the price of French fries in Indonesia? Well, let the central banker fix it. Let him move the interest rate in such a way. But at least there's money for people in Pulau Rote. There's money in Tarakan, money in Lahat, money in Manokwari, money in all the villages in Southeast Asia.
Please join me in thanking our speaker for sharing his insights with us so generously.
Inilah Endgame.